The riders came at dawn with cracked leather reins and voices that turned her name into something filthy. Ayla Redfern had been running for weeks, sleeping in ditches, stealing bread from back porches, praying the bruises would fade before anyone asked questions. She thought the train station would be safe. She was wrong. When Wyatt Mercer found her that frozen November night, half dead on a bench with nowhere left to go, he made her an offer no man had made before: shelter without a price. What happened next would change both their lives forever. If you want to see how far courage can travel when fear has no more road to run, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story reaches. The wind off the plains bit hard enough to draw blood if you stood still too long. Wyatt Mercer kept moving. He always did. His boots rang hollow on the warped planks of the station platform, frost crackling under his heels like broken glass. The train had come and gone an hour ago, maybe two. He'd missed it. Again. But the errand into town had taken longer than expected. The livery stable short on nails, the general store out of flour, the whole operation slow as molasses in January. He'd given up and decided to head back to the ranch before the temperature dropped any further. That's when he saw her. She was curled on the far bench near the ticket window, barely visible in the dim glow of the station's single lantern. A woman. Alone. Asleep or unconscious, he couldn't tell. Her shawl was thin, the kind that wouldn't keep a sparrow warm, and her breath came out in short, shallow clouds. Wyatt stopped walking. His hand went to the brim of his hat, adjusting it without thinking, the way a man does when he's unsure whether to involve himself or keep moving. He looked around. The station was empty. The station master had gone home. The ticket window was dark. No one else was coming. Wyatt walked closer. She stirred as his shadow fell over her, jerking upright with a sharp intake of breath. Her eyes snapped open, dark and wild, and for a second he thought she might bolt. Her hand went to her side, fingers curling around the edge of her shawl like it was a weapon. She looked at him the way a cornered animal looks at a wolf. "Easy," Wyatt said, holding up one hand. His voice was low, steady. "Didn't mean to startle you." She didn't relax. Her eyes tracked his movements, every shift of weight, every breath. She was young, maybe 25, with long black hair pulled back in a braid that had come loose at the ends. Her skin was tanned and weathered, her cheekbones sharp. Native, he thought, though he didn't know which tribe and didn't plan to ask unless she offered. What he did notice was the bruise on her wrist, dark purple turning yellow at the edges, and the way she kept that arm tucked close to her ribs. "You waiting on someone?" he asked. She didn't answer. "Train's not coming back till Thursday," he said. "That's 3 days from now." Still nothing. Just that hard, unblinking stare. Wyatt exhaled through his nose, his breath fogging in the cold. He could leave. Should leave, probably. Whatever trouble she was in wasn't his business. He had a ranch to run, cattle to feed, fences that needed mending before the snow got worse. He didn't need complications. But he also didn't need to lie to himself. He knew what it looked like when someone was running. "Look," he said, softer now. "I don't know what you're mixed up in, and I'm not asking. But you stay out here tonight, you're gonna freeze to death. I got a place about 6 miles west, warm fire, hot food, and a roof that doesn't leak much. You can sleep in the barn if you want. No strings." Her eyes narrowed. "No strings," she repeated. Her voice was hoarse, like she hadn't used it in a while. "No strings," Wyatt said again. She studied him for a long moment, and he let her. He knew what she was doing. She was weighing her options, calculating risk, trying to decide if he was the kind of man who kept his word or the kind who said one thing and did another. He'd seen that look before. On strays. On men who'd lost everything. On himself, once, a long time ago. Finally, she stood. Slowly. She was taller than he'd expected, nearly his height, and built lean like someone who'd spent most of their life working. She wrapped the shawl tighter around her shoulders and picked up a small bundle from the bench, a cloth sack tied with fraying rope. "Barn's fine," she said. Wyatt nodded. "Barn it is." He turned and started walking toward the edge of the platform where his horse was tied. She followed a few paces behind, quiet as a shadow. He didn't look back. Didn't need to. He could hear her boots scuffing the planks, the faint rustle of her shawl in the wind. When they reached his horse, a big roan gelding named Tucker, Wyatt swung into the saddle and offered her a hand up. She hesitated. "Tucker won't bite," Wyatt said. "Can't say the same for me, but I'll try to behave." Her mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. She took his hand and let him pull her up behind him. She settled onto the horse's back with the ease of someone who'd ridden before, though she kept a careful distance between them, her hands gripping the edge of the saddle instead of his coat. Wyatt clicked his tongue and nudged Tucker into a walk. The station fell away behind them, swallowed by the dark. The plain stretched out on all sides, endless and empty, the kind of landscape that made a man feel small. The wind picked up, cutting through his coat, and he felt her shift slightly, leaning closer to block the worst of it. They rode in silence for a long time. Wyatt wasn't much for talking anyway, and she didn't seem inclined to start. That was fine by him. Words didn't change much out here. The land didn't care what you said. It only cared what you did. About halfway to the ranch, she spoke. "Why'd you stop?" Wyatt glanced over his shoulder. "What's that?" "At the station," she said. "Why'd you stop? You could have kept walking." He thought about that. "Could have," he agreed. "Didn't seem right, though. Most people don't care what's right. Most people aren't worth knowing." She went quiet again, but he felt her grip on the saddle relax just a fraction. When the ranch came into view, it wasn't much to look at. A low cabin with a stone chimney, a barn that sagged on one side, a corral with 3 horses standing hip-shot in the cold. The yard was mud and frozen grass, scattered with tools and firewood. It looked like what it was, a place where a man worked alone and didn't waste time on appearances. Wyatt dismounted and helped her down. She landed light on her feet, her eyes sweeping over the property with the same careful assessment she'd given him earlier. "Barn's through there," he said, pointing. "There's hay in the loft, blankets in the tack room. I'll bring you something to eat in a bit." She nodded, still watching him. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, then said, "Ayla." "Wyatt," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Welcome to the middle of nowhere, Ayla." He led Tucker to the corral and unsaddled him, working quickly in the cold. By the time he finished, Ayla had disappeared into the barn. He stood there for a moment, looking at the dark shape of the building, then turned and headed for the cabin. Inside, the fire had burned low. He stoked it back to life, added a few logs, and set a pot of stew on the stove to reheat. While it warmed, he cut thick slices of bread and poured water into a tin cup. When the stew was hot, he ladled it into a bowl, wrapped the bread in a cloth, and carried everything out to the barn. The door creaked when he pushed it open. Ayla was sitting on a bale of hay near the back, her satchel at her feet, her shawl still wrapped tight. She looked up when he came in, her expression unreadable. "Figured you'd be hungry," Wyatt said, setting the bowl and bread on a crate nearby. "Stew's nothing fancy, but it's hot." "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded and turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "You live here alone?" Wyatt paused in the doorway. "Yeah. No wife? No family?" "No." She didn't ask why, and he didn't offer an explanation. He just tipped his hat and walked back to the cabin, leaving her to her meal. That night, Wyatt lay in his narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. The wind rattled the shutters, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. He thought about the bruise on Ayla's wrist, about the way she'd flinched when he'd moved too fast, about the careful, measured way she'd answered his questions, like every word cost her something. He didn't know her story, and he wasn't fool enough to think she'd tell him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But he knew enough to recognize the shape of it. Someone had hurt her. Someone had made her run. And now she was here, in his barn, eating his food, trying to figure out if he was safe or just another kind of danger. Wyatt rolled onto his side and closed his eyes. He'd give her time. That was all he could do. Time and space and the promise that as long as she was on his land, no one would lay a hand on her. It was the least he could offer. And maybe, if she stayed long enough, it would be enough. Morning came cold and gray. Wyatt woke before dawn, as he always did, and dressed quickly in the dark. He built up the fire, made coffee, and fried eggs and bacon in the cast-iron skillet. When everything was ready, he stepped outside and crossed the yard to the barn. Ayla was already awake. She'd folded the blankets neatly and stacked them on the crate, and she was standing by the door looking out at the fields. She turned when she heard his footsteps. "Morning," Wyatt said. "Morning," she replied. "Got breakfast if you want it." She followed him to the cabin without a word. Inside, he gestured to the table, and she sat. He set a plate in front of her and poured her a cup of coffee, black and strong. She picked up the fork and ate slowly, methodically, like someone who'd learned not to waste food. Wyatt sat across from her and ate his own meal. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was just quiet. The kind of quiet you got used to when you lived alone. When she finished, she pushed the plate away and looked at him. "I can work," she said. Wyatt raised an eyebrow. "Didn't ask you to." "I know," she said, "but I'm not taking charity. If I'm staying, I'm working." He considered that. "You know anything about ranching?" "Some. I can mend fences, feed animals, chop wood." "All right," Wyatt said. "There's plenty to do. You can start with the horses. They need hay and fresh water." She nodded and stood, carrying her plate to the basin. She washed it without being asked, then headed for the door. "Ayla," Wyatt said. She stopped, looking back. "You don't have to prove anything," he said. "Not to me." Her expression softened, just a little. "Maybe not," she said, "but I need to prove it to myself." She left, and Wyatt sat alone at the table, his coffee growing cold in his hands. Over the next few days, Ayla became a fixture on the ranch. She worked hard, harder than he'd expected, and she didn't complain. She mucked stalls, hauled water, repaired broken tools, and helped him drag cedar posts across the north pasture to replace a section of fence that had collapsed in the last storm. She didn't talk much, but she didn't need to. Her hands spoke for her. They were strong, capable, scarred in places. The hands of someone who'd survived. Wyatt found himself watching her when he thought she wasn't looking. The way she moved, efficient and deliberate. The way she spoke to the horses, low and soothing, like she understood something about them he didn't. The way she stood at the edge of the corral sometimes, staring out at the horizon, her face unreadable. He didn't ask about the bruise. Didn't ask where she'd come from or who she was running from. He figured if she wanted to tell him, she would. And if she didn't, that was her right. But one night, after they'd spent the day clearing brush from the creek bed, she did. They were sitting by the fire in the cabin, the day's work behind them, the warmth seeping into their tired muscles. Ayla had her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, her eyes fixed on the flames. "I was traveling," she said suddenly. Wyatt glanced at her but didn't interrupt. "Looking for work," she continued. "There was a man. Said he knew someone who needed help on a farm a few towns over. Good pay," he said. "A place to stay." It sounded safe. She paused, her jaw tightening. "It wasn't," she said. "When I got there, there was no farm, just a house. And men. They told me I owed them for the ride, for the food, for the room. They said I'd work it off, but the debt kept growing. And when I tried to leave..." She stopped, her knuckles white around the cup. Wyatt felt something cold settle in his chest. "They hurt you." It wasn't a question. "They tried," Ayla said. "I fought, got away in the middle of the night, been running ever since." Wyatt set his own cup down and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "They know where you are?" "I don't think so," she said, "but I don't know for sure." He nodded slowly. "Well," he said, "if they show up here, they'll regret it." She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." "Don't need to," Wyatt said. "Nobody's got the right to treat another person that way. Not in my book." She held his gaze for a long moment, then looked back at the fire. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me yet," Wyatt said. "Let's just get through winter first." A faint smile crossed her lips, and for the first time since he'd found her, Wyatt saw something other than fear in her eyes. Hope, maybe, or the beginning of it. The days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of the ranch settled over them like snow. They worked side by side, speaking only when necessary, but the silence between them was no longer tense. It was comfortable, familiar. The kind of silence shared by people who understood each other without needing words. Wyatt noticed the changes in her, the way she stood straighter, the way her hands no longer shook when she reached for something, the way she smiled, just a little, when one of the horses nuzzled her shoulder. She was healing, slowly but surely. And if he was honest with himself, so was he. He'd been alone for a long time. Too long, maybe. He told himself he preferred it that way, that solitude was easier than the mess of caring about someone. But having Ayla here, working beside him, sitting across from him at the table, made him realize how empty the ranch had felt before. He didn't say any of that, of course. He wasn't good with words. Never had been. But he made sure she had enough to eat, made sure the barn stayed warm, made sure she knew in whatever small ways he could that she was safe. And for a while it was enough, until the day the riders came. Wyatt saw them first. He was out by the corral, shoeing one of the horses, when he caught the glint of sunlight on metal in the distance. He straightened, shading his eyes, and counted 3 men on horseback, moving slow and deliberate across the southern ridge. His gut tightened. Ayla was in the barn, mending a saddle. He walked quickly to the door and leaned in. "We got company," he said. She looked up, her face going pale. "How many?" "3. She stood, setting the saddle aside, her hands already trembling. "It's them," she said. "It has to be." Wyatt didn't waste time arguing. "Stay inside," he said. Don't come out unless I call for you." "Wyatt!" "Stay inside," he repeated, his voice firm but not unkind. She nodded, her eyes wide, and he turned and walked back to the corral. The riders were closer now, close enough that he could make out their faces. Hard men, the kind who made their living off other people's misery. They reined in at the edge of the yard, their horses stamping and blowing, and the one in the middle, a thick-shouldered man with a graying beard, leaned forward in his saddle. "You Mercer?" the man asked. "I am," Wyatt said. His voice was calm, but his hand rested easy on the hammer at his belt. "We're looking for someone," the man said. "Woman, native, about this tall." He held his hand up. "Might have come through here a few weeks back?" Wyatt's jaw tightened. "Don't know what you're talking about." The man's eyes narrowed. "That's so?" "That's so." The rider to the left, younger, with a scar running down his cheek, spat into the dirt. "We got reason to believe she's here, old man. And we ain't leaving without her." Wyatt didn't move. "You got no reason to believe anything," he said evenly. "And unless you're the law, which I'm guessing you're not, you got no business on my land." The bearded man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "She owes us," he said. "Took off without paying her debts. We just want what's ours." "She's not yours," Wyatt said, his voice dropping lower. "And she's not leaving." The third rider, silent until now, shifted in his saddle. His hand moved toward the rifle strapped to his side. Wyatt saw it. So did the bearded man. "Easy," the man said, raising a hand. He looked back at Wyatt. "You really want to die over some runaway squaw?" Wyatt took a step forward. His hand didn't leave the hammer. "You really want to find out what happens if you try to take her?" The yard went still. The wind died. Even the horses seemed to sense the shift. The bearded man stared at Wyatt for a long moment, his jaw working. Then he spat and pulled his horse's head around. "This ain't over," he said. "Yeah," Wyatt said. "It is." The riders turned and rode off, dust rising in their wake. Wyatt stood there until they disappeared over the ridge, his heart pounding in his chest. When he finally turned back to the barn, Ayla was standing in the doorway. Her face was streaked with tears, but her eyes were fierce. "You could have died," she said. "Didn't, though," Wyatt said. She crossed the yard and stopped in front of him, close enough that he could see the pulse hammering in her throat. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do that?" Wyatt looked at her, this woman who'd come into his life by accident, who'd brought warmth and purpose to a place that had been cold and empty for too long. He didn't have a good answer, didn't have the right words, so he just told her the truth. "Because you matter," he said, and for the first time since he'd known her, Ayla Redfern smiled. That smile didn't last long. It flickered across her face like sunlight through storm clouds, there and gone before Wyatt could be sure he'd really seen it. Then Ayla's expression hardened again, her shoulders pulling back, her hands curling into fists at her sides. "They'll come back," she said. Wyatt didn't argue. He knew she was right. Men like that didn't let go easy. They'd wait, regroup, come back with more numbers or under cover of dark. The confrontation had bought them time, nothing more. "Maybe," he said, "but not today." Ayla looked past him toward the ridge where the riders had disappeared, her jaw set. "I should leave, before they bring more trouble." No, the word came out harder than he'd meant it to. She flinched, just slightly, and he saw the old fear flash across her face. He gentled his voice. "You leave now, you'll be alone out there. Easy pickings. You're safer here. Safe, she repeated, bitter. I don't even know what that means anymore. Wyatt stepped closer, slow and careful, like approaching a spooked horse. It means you stay put. It means we keep our eyes open. And it means if they come back, they'll find more than they bargained for. She studied his face, searching for something. Conviction, maybe, or a lie she could call him on. Whatever she was looking for, she must have found it, because after a moment she nodded. All right, she said quietly. But I'm not hiding. If they come, I face them. Didn't expect anything less, Wyatt said. They stood there in the yard, the wind picking up again, carrying the smell of coming snow. Finally, Ayla turned and walked back to the barn. Wyatt watched her go, then headed for the cabin. Inside, he pulled his rifle down from the rack above the door, checked the ammunition, and set it within easy reach of the table. He hadn't needed it in months, hoped he wouldn't need it now. But hope wasn't a strategy. The rest of the day passed in tense silence. They went through the motions of work, feeding the animals, checking the water troughs, splitting wood for the fire. But the easy rhythm they'd built over the past weeks was gone. Every sound made them both look up. Every shadow drew their eyes. That night, Ayla didn't go to the barn. I'll sleep in here, she said when Wyatt started to suggest it. On the floor, by the fire. He didn't argue. He dragged a chair near the door, the rifle across his lap, and settled in for a long watch. Ayla wrapped herself in a blanket and lay down near the hearth, but he could tell from her breathing she wasn't sleeping. Neither was he. They stayed that way until dawn, two people pretending to rest while the darkness pressed against the windows. Morning came gray and cold. Wyatt made coffee and fried cornmeal cakes in bacon grease. They ate without talking, exhaustion sitting heavy between them. When the dishes were cleared, Ayla spoke. Teach me to shoot. Wyatt paused, his hand on the coffee pot. You know how? A little, but not well enough. He considered that. A woman who could handle a rifle was a woman who could defend herself. And given the circumstances, it wasn't a bad idea. All right, he said, after we finished the fence line. They spent the morning working the north pasture, driving posts into the frozen ground and stringing wire between them. The work was brutal, the kind that left your hands raw and your back screaming, but it kept their minds occupied. They didn't talk much. Just the occasional instruction, the rhythm of labor filling the spaces where words might have been. By midday, they'd finished. Wyatt stepped back, surveying the line of fence stretching across the field, and nodded. That'll hold. Ayla pulled off her gloves and flexed her fingers. Her hands were red, the skin split in a few places. She didn't complain, just wiped the blood on her pants and looked at him. Now? Now, Wyatt agreed. He fetched the rifle and a box of cartridges from the cabin, then led her out past the corral to a clearing where the land opened up. He set up a row of tin cans on a fallen log about 50 yards out, then came back to where she stood waiting. You ever fire one of these? He asked, holding up the rifle. Once, a long time ago. All right, first thing you need to know is respect. A rifle's not a toy. You point it at something, you better be ready to kill it. Understand? She met his eyes. I understand. He showed her how to hold it, how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to line up the sights. She followed his instructions carefully, her movements deliberate. When she was ready, he stepped back. Take your time. Breathe out slow. Squeeze. Don't pull. She sighted down the barrel, her body tense. The shot cracked across the clearing, loud enough to scatter the crows from the trees. The bullet kicked up dirt 6 feet to the left of the cans. Too much tension, Wyatt said. You're fighting the recoil. Let the rifle do the work. She adjusted, tried again. This time the bullet clipped the edge of the log. Better, keep going. They spent the next hour out there, Ayla firing round after round while Wyatt watched and corrected. She was a fast learner, her focus absolute. By the time the box of cartridges was empty, she'd hit 3 cans and come close to several others. Not bad, Wyatt said as she lowered the rifle. Not good enough, Ayla replied, her voice tight with frustration. You'll get there. Takes practice, same as anything else. She handed the rifle back to him, her face unreadable. Thank you. Don't mention it. They walked back to the ranch in silence, the sun starting its slow descent toward the horizon. When they reached the cabin, Wyatt cleaned the rifle and put it away while Ayla started on dinner. She'd taken over most of the cooking without being asked, and he'd let her. She was better at it than him, and the meals had improved considerably since she'd arrived. Tonight it was beans and salt pork, simple but filling. They ate by the fire, the warmth slowly seeping back into their bones. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Wyatt glanced toward the window, then back at Ayla. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked. She looked up from her plate. "What do you mean?" "After winter, when the road's clear, you planning to move on?" The question hung in the air between them. Ayla set down her fork, her expression guarded. "I don't know," she said finally. "Haven't thought that far ahead." Wyatt nodded. He understood that. When you were running, you didn't think about next month or next year. You thought about tonight, tomorrow morning, the next meal. Anything beyond that was a luxury you couldn't afford. "Well," he said, "you're welcome to stay as long as you want. No pressure either way." She studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes searching his face. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "Really?" "Told you already. You said I mattered. That's not a reason. That's just words." Wyatt set his own plate aside and leaned back in his chair. He wasn't good at this, talking about things that lived beneath the surface. But she deserved an honest answer. "Had a sister once," he said. "Younger than me. Sweet kid. Got mixed up with the wrong man when she was about your age. He was charming at first, or so she said. By the time we realized what he really was, it was too late. He'd isolated her, convinced her she had nowhere else to go. When she finally tried to leave, he killed her." Ayla's face went pale. "Wyatt." "I was working a cattle drive up north when it happened," he continued, his voice flat. "Didn't find out till I got back 3 months later. By then he'd disappeared. Never did find him. Never got justice for her." He stopped, his throat tight. He hadn't talked about Sarah in years, hadn't let himself think about her, about the guilt that still sat like a stone in his chest. "So when I see someone running," he said quietly, "someone who's scared and hurt and got nowhere to go, I don't walk away. Can't bring Sarah back, but maybe I can do right by someone else." Ayla was silent for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick. "I'm sorry," she said, "about your sister." "Me too." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. The gesture was simple, but it hit him harder than he'd expected. He looked down at their joined hands, hers small and scarred, his rough and calloused, and felt something shift in his chest. "Thank you for telling me," Ayla said. Wyatt nodded, not trusting himself to speak. After a moment, she withdrew her hand and stood, gathering the dishes. He watched her move around the cabin, quiet and efficient, and realized with a start that he didn't want her to leave. Not in the spring. Not ever. The thought should have scared him. Instead, it just felt right. That night, Ayla slept in the cabin again, and Wyatt kept watch by the door. But somewhere around midnight, exhaustion finally won. He dozed off in the chair, the rifle slipping sideways across his lap. When he woke with a start an hour later, heart pounding, it was to find Ayla sitting up by the fire, fully alert. "Go to bed," she said quietly. "I'll watch." "You need sleep too." "I'll sleep when you wake up. We'll take turns." It made sense. He was too tired to argue. He moved to the narrow cot against the wall and lay down, boots still on, and fell asleep almost instantly. When he woke again, pale winter light was filtering through the window. Ayla was asleep by the fire, the blanket pulled up to her chin, her face soft in a way he'd never seen it. He stood carefully, not wanting to wake her, and slipped outside. The yard was quiet. No riders on the horizon, no tracks in the frost. He breathed out slowly, relief mixing with the cold air. Maybe they'd given up. Maybe the stand he'd made had been enough to send them looking elsewhere. Or maybe they were just biding their time. He went about the morning chores, feeding the horses and checking the stock. When he came back inside, Ayla was awake, stoking the fire. "Quiet out there?" she asked. "So far." She nodded, but the tension didn't leave her shoulders. The days that followed fell into a new pattern. They worked hard during daylight, pushing through the tasks that winter demanded, but they stayed close to the ranch. No trips to town, no unnecessary risks. At night, they took turns keeping watch, though more often than not they both ended up awake, sitting by the fire and talking in low voices. Wyatt learned more about her in those quiet hours than he had in all the weeks before. She'd grown up in a small community to the east, the daughter of a woman who'd raised her alone after her father disappeared. She'd learned to work young, taking any job she could find to help make ends meet. When her mother died 2 years ago, she'd been left with nothing. No family, no home, just the clothes on her back and a hunger to survive. I thought if I kept moving, I'd find somewhere that felt right, she said one night. Somewhere I could belong. But every place I went, I was just passing through, a stranger, invisible. You're not invisible here, Wyatt said. She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. No, she said softly. I'm not. In turn, Wyatt told her about the ranch, about how he'd bought it 10 years ago with money saved from years of trail driving and rough work. He'd thought it would be a fresh start, a place to build something permanent, but the isolation had been harder than he'd expected. The winters were brutal, the summers weren't much better, and being alone wore on a man in ways he hadn't anticipated. So why stay? Ayla asked. Stubbornness, mostly, Wyatt said with a dry smile. And pride. Didn't want to admit I'd made a mistake. Is it a mistake? He thought about that. A month ago, he might have said yes, but now sitting across from her, the cabin warm and the silence comfortable, he wasn't so sure. Ask me again in the spring, he said. One afternoon, while they were mucking out the stalls, Ayla paused and leaned on her pitchfork. Can I ask you something? Sure. Why haven't you asked me about the details? About what happened before I got here? Wyatt straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. Figured it's your business. You want to tell me, you will. You don't, that's fine too. Most people would have asked. I'm not most people. She smiled just a little. No, you're not. But later that night, as they sat by the fire, she told him anyway. There were 4 of them, she said, her voice steady but her hands clenched tight around her cup. The man who offered me the job and 3 others. They had a house about 2 days' ride from here, run-down place. Looked like it used to be a farm, but nothing was growing anymore. Wyatt listened without interrupting. When I got there, they told me the work was inside, cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing. Seemed reasonable at first, but then they started adding things, said I owed them for the room, for the food, for the ride. The debt kept growing, and every time I tried to leave, they'd block the door. Tell me I couldn't go until I'd worked it off. Her voice cracked slightly, but she pushed on. One night, the leader, the one who'd hired me, he came into my room, told me there were other ways to settle the debt. I fought him off, broke a lamp over his head. He hit me. She touched her wrist, where the bruise had faded to a dull yellow. But I got out, ran into the woods, and didn't stop until I couldn't run anymore. Ended up at that train station 3 days later. Wyatt's jaw was tight, his hands curled into fists. You know their names? The leader went by Harlow. Don't know if that was real or not. The others, I only heard first names. Cade, Dutch, Silas. Harlow, Wyatt repeated, committing it to memory. He the one with the beard? Ayla nodded. You think they'll come back? I think men like that don't like being told no, but if they do, they'll regret it. She looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I don't want you to get hurt because of me. Won't be because of you, Wyatt said firmly. Be because they're cowards who prey on people weaker than them. That's on them, not you. She wiped at her eyes, nodding. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Finally, Ayla spoke again. I've never had anyone stand up for me before, she said quietly. Not like this. Well, Wyatt said, you do now. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. Snow fell in earnest, blanketing the ranch in white and sealing them in. They worked together to winterize everything, securing the barn, stacking firewood, rationing supplies. The isolation didn't bother Wyatt. He'd lived through plenty of hard winters alone. But this one felt different, less lonely, almost comfortable. Ayla had a way of filling the silence without crowding it. She hummed while she worked, old songs he didn't recognize, and sometimes she'd tell him stories about her childhood, small memories that painted a picture of a life very different from his. In return, he taught her things. How to read the weather, how to tell if a horse was favoring a leg, how to make a fire that would last through the night. One evening, as they sat by the fire after a long day of clearing snow from the roof, Ayla asked, Do you ever get scared? Wyatt glanced at her. Of what? Anything. Everything. Being alone, losing what you have. He thought about that. Yeah, he said finally. I get scared. Just don't let it stop me. How? By doing what needs doing anyway. Fear's just noise. You can listen to it, or you can keep moving. She nodded slowly, absorbing that. I've been listening to it for a long time. And now? Now I'm trying to move. Wyatt smiled. You're doing fine. But the peace didn't last. A week later, just after dawn, Wyatt stepped outside to find fresh tracks in the snow. Boot prints, leading up to the barn and then back out again, heading south. His blood went cold. He went back inside, his face grim. Ayla looked up from the stove, and whatever she saw in his expression made her go still. They were here, Wyatt said. When? Last night, while we were asleep. Ayla's face drained of color. Why didn't they? Don't know. Maybe they were scouting, seeing what we had. How many of us there are. He grabbed the rifle from the rack. But they'll be back, soon. What do we do? Wyatt looked at her, this woman who'd come into his life by accident and turned it into something worth protecting. We get ready, he said, and we make damn sure they don't get what they came for. Ayla straightened, her fear hardening into resolve. Tell me what you need. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Wyatt checked every window, every door, making sure they could be barred from the inside. He moved ammunition into the cabin, along with extra water and food. Ayla helped him drag heavy furniture into position, creating cover they could use if it came to a fight. You remember what I taught you? Wyatt asked, handing her the revolver he kept in his saddlebag. I remember. Good. If they get inside, you aim for center mass and you don't stop pulling the trigger until they're down. Understand? I understand. He hated the necessity of it, hated that she had to think this way. But he hated the men hunting her more. That night, they didn't sleep. They sat in the dark, backs to the wall, weapons within reach. The wind howled outside and every creak of the cabin made them tense. But the hours passed and no one came. Dawn broke cold and clear. Wyatt stood and stretched, his muscles stiff. Ayla was slumped against the wall, her eyes half closed. Get some rest, he said. I'll keep watch. Wyatt, rest, he said more gently. You're no good to me exhausted. She nodded reluctantly and curled up by the fire. Within minutes, she was asleep. Wyatt sat by the window, rifle across his knees, and watched the horizon. The sun climbed higher, turning the snow to blinding white. Nothing moved. No riders. No tracks. Just the endless expanse of winter. But he knew better than to relax. The waiting was its own kind of torture, the not knowing worse than any fight. And somewhere out there, Harlow and his men were planning their next move. Wyatt tightened his grip on the rifle. Let them come. They came 3 days later, just past noon, when the sun sat high and useless in a white sky. Wyatt was out by the woodpile, splitting logs with steady, methodical swings. Ayla was inside making bread, her hands dusty with flour. The first warning was Tucker's whinny from the corral, sharp and nervous. Wyatt's axe froze mid-swing. He turned slowly, scanning the horizon. 6 riders this time, twice as many as before. They came from the east, moving in a loose line across the snow, their horses' breath steaming in the cold air. Wyatt recognized Harlow in the lead, his beard frosted white, and Cade beside him with that scar cutting down his face like a brand. The others were new, hired guns probably, men who'd do anything for the right price. Wyatt set the axe down carefully and walked toward the cabin. He didn't run. Running showed fear, and fear was blood in the water to men like these. He kept his movements calm, deliberate, even as his heart kicked hard against his ribs. Ayla, he called as he pushed through the door. She looked up from the dough, read his face, and went pale. How many? 6. Her hand stilled. 6. Get the rifle. Stay by the window on the north side. Don't shoot unless I tell you to, but be ready. She nodded and moved quickly, wiping the flour from her hands on her apron before reaching for the Winchester. Her hands shook slightly as she checked the chamber, but her jaw was set. Wyatt grabbed his own rifle from where it leaned against the wall and took up position by the door. The riders stopped about 30 yards out, spreading into a rough semicircle. Harlow dismounted first, landing heavy in the snow. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with a kind of face that looked mean even when he smiled. And he was smiling now. Mercer, he called out. "We need to talk." Wyatt opened the door and stepped onto the porch, rifle held loose in both hands. Not aimed at anyone yet, but ready. "Got nothing to say to you." "Now that's unfriendly," Harlow said, "especially since we rode all this way in the cold just to have a conversation." "You had your conversation last time. I told you to get off my land. You came back anyway." Harlow's smile widened. "See, that's where we have a problem. You got something that belongs to us, and we aim to take it back." "She doesn't belong to anyone," Wyatt said, his voice flat and hard. "Least of all you." One of the new men, a thin fellow with a rifle slung across his saddle, spat into the snow. "We don't have time for this, Harlow. Just torch the place and be done with it." Wyatt's finger moved to the trigger guard. Not inside yet, but close. Harlow raised a hand, still grinning. "Easy, Davis. No need to get hasty. I'm trying to be reasonable here." He turned back to Wyatt. "How about this? You hand over the girl, we pay you for your trouble. Say, $50? That's more than fair for a few weeks of room and board." "She's not for sale." "Everything's for sale, friend. Just a matter of price." "I'm not your friend," Wyatt said. "And the price for her is more than you got. Now turn around and ride out before this gets ugly." Harlow's smile finally faded. "You're making a mistake, old man. There's 6 of us and 1 of you." "2. Ayla's voice rang out from inside the cabin, clear and strong, despite the tremor underneath. The barrel of the Winchester appeared in the window, aimed squarely at Harlow's chest. Harlow's eyes flicked toward the window, then back to Wyatt. 2, then. Still bad odds. "Maybe," Wyatt said, "but I'll make sure you're the first to go down. That a bet you want to take?" The yard went silent except for the wind and the nervous stamping of horses. Wyatt watched Harlow's face, watched the calculation happening behind his eyes. Men like him were used to people backing down, used to getting their way through intimidation and numbers. But every now and then they ran into someone who wouldn't fold, someone too stubborn or too principled or just too tired to care about the consequences. Wyatt was all 3. "You know what your problem is, Mercer?" Harlow said finally. "You think you're some kind of hero, standing up for the weak, protecting the helpless. But all you're doing is prolonging the inevitable. She's coming with us. Today, tomorrow, next week. Doesn't matter. We'll keep coming back until we get what we want." "Then I guess you'll keep getting disappointed," Wyatt said. Cade shifted in his saddle, his hand drifting toward his pistol. "Let me put a bullet in him, Harlow. We're wasting time." "You draw that gun," Wyatt said, his eyes locked on Cade. "And you better make sure the first shot kills me, because if it doesn't, I'll put you in the ground before you get off a second." Cade's hand froze. Harlow laughed, but it sounded forced. "You got brass, I'll give you that. But brass won't stop 6 bullets. Won't have to stop 6, Wyatt said. Just 1. Yours." The standoff stretched out, seconds bleeding into minutes. Wyatt's arms were starting to ache from holding the rifle ready, but he didn't lower it, didn't even blink. He could feel sweat trickling down his spine despite the cold, could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Behind him, through the open door, he heard Ayla's breathing, quick and shallow. "This is your last chance," Harlow said. "Walk away. Let us take what's ours and we'll forget this ever happened." "No." "You're willing to die for some woman you barely know?" "I'm willing to die for what's right," Wyatt said. "Can you say the same?" That hit something. Wyatt saw it in the way Harlow's jaw tightened, the way his shoulders went rigid. Men like him didn't like being challenged on their morality, didn't like being reminded that what they were doing was wrong. It made them angry, made them sloppy. "Fine," Harlow said, his voice gone cold. "Have it your way." He turned and walked back to his horse. For a moment, Wyatt thought they were actually leaving. Then Harlow swung into the saddle and looked back, his eyes hard as flint. "We'll be back tonight," he said, "and next time we won't ask." The riders turned and rode off, their horses kicking up snow in their wake. Wyatt stood on the porch until they disappeared over the ridge, then lowered his rifle and let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Ayla appeared in the doorway, the Winchester still clutched in her hands. Her face was white, her eyes wide. "They're really coming back." "Yeah. Tonight." That's what he said. She set the rifle down with shaking hands and leaned against the doorframe. "We can't fight 6 men, Wyatt. We'll die." "Maybe, but we'll take a few of them with us." "That's not funny." "Wasn't trying to be." He turned to face her. Look, I'm not going to lie to you. This is bad, real bad, but running's not an option. You go out there alone, they'll catch you before you make it 5 miles. Our best chance is to hold them off here. Hold them off, she repeated, her voice hollow. For how long? Long enough. Long enough for what? Wyatt didn't have an answer to that. Long enough for them to give up? Not likely. Long enough for help to arrive? There was no help. The nearest town was 2 days' ride, and even if he could get word to the marshal, the law didn't move fast enough to matter. They were on their own. Long enough to make them regret coming here, he said finally. Isla looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, what do we do? They spent the afternoon turning the cabin into a fortress. Wyatt nailed boards across the windows, leaving narrow gaps to shoot through. He dragged sacks of grain and barrels of flour against the walls for extra cover. Ayla filled every container they had with water, knowing that if the siege lasted more than a day, they'd need it. They moved all the ammunition into the cabin and loaded every gun they had. 2 rifles, 3 pistols, and an old shotgun that Wyatt kept for close work. While they worked, they talked strategy. They'll come after dark, Wyatt said, hammering another board into place. Probably split up. Some will try the front, some will try the back or the sides. They'll want to keep us divided, make us guess where the real attack's coming from. So what do? We pick one side to defend and we hold it. Let them waste their time on the others. Which side? The door. It's the strongest point and it gives us a clear line of fire. We barricade everything else and focus our attention here. Ayla nodded, absorbing that. What if they try to burn us out? Wyatt paused. He'd been thinking about that too. Fire was the worst-case scenario, the one thing they couldn't really defend against. If Harlow and his men decided to torch the cabin, their options were to burn alive or run out into the open and get shot. Then we make sure they don't get close enough to try, he said. It wasn't a good answer, but it was the only one he had. By the time the sun started to set, they'd done everything they could. The cabin was as secure as it was going to get. They ate a cold meal, not wanting to risk a fire that might give away their position, and then they waited. Darkness came fast this time of year, the light bleeding out of the sky like water from a cracked jar. Wyatt sat by the door with his rifle, Ayla beside him with the Winchester. Outside, the wind picked up, howling across the plains and making the cabin creak. Every sound set Wyatt's nerves on edge. Every shadow looked like a man creeping closer. You scared? Ayla asked quietly. Yeah. Me too. They sat in silence for a while. Then Ayla spoke again. If we don't make it through this... Don't, Wyatt said. I need to say it. If we don't make it, I want you to know that these last few weeks have meant more to me than anything in my whole life. You gave me something I thought I'd lost. Hope, safety, a reason to keep going. I don't know how to thank you for that. Wyatt turned to look at her, her face barely visible in the darkness. You don't need to thank me, he said. You did the same for me. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was strong. They sat like that, hand in hand, waiting for the storm to come. It started just after midnight. The first shot shattered the silence, the bullet punching through one of the boarded windows and burying itself in the far wall. Wyatt and Ayla both jerked upright, hearts racing. They're here, Wyatt said. More shots followed, coming from multiple directions. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like fireflies. Wyatt couldn't tell how many shooters there were or where they were positioned, but it didn't matter. He aimed for the flashes and fired back, the rifle kicking hard against his shoulder. Beside him, Ayla did the same, her shots measured and deliberate. The gunfight was chaos, noise and smoke and the acrid stink of gunpowder. Wyatt's ears rang from the explosions, his eyes watered from the smoke. He reloaded by feel, his hands moving automatically, and kept firing. Across from him, Ayla's face was set in grim concentration, her fear buried beneath a layer of pure survival instinct. Then a voice cut through the noise. Cease fire! The shooting stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the gunfire, heavy and expectant. Wyatt kept his rifle trained on the door, his breath coming hard and fast. Mercer! Harlow's voice, somewhere out in the darkness. You listening? Wyatt didn't answer. You're making this harder than it needs to be. We don't want to kill you. We just want the girl. Send her out and we'll leave you alone. Go to hell. Wyatt shouted back. Harlow laughed. Figured you'd say that? All right then, we tried doing this the easy way, now we do it the hard way. A new sound reached Wyatt's ears, glass breaking, liquid splashing, and then, worse than anything, the smell of kerosene. No, Ayla whispered. Wyatt's mind raced. They were going to burn them out, force them into the open. It was the smart play, the one he'd been dreading. We have to go, Ayla said, her voice rising in panic. We have to run. Hold on, Wyatt said. An idea was forming, desperate and probably stupid, but it was better than nothing. You still got that revolver I gave you? Yes. Good. When I say go, you run for the barn. Don't stop, don't look back, just run. Get to the horses and ride. Head west toward the mountain pass. Don't worry about me. I'm not leaving you. You are. Because if you don't, we both die. Wyatt, listen to me. He grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. I can't protect you if I'm worried about you getting shot. I need you to trust me. Can you do that? She stared at him, tears streaming down her face. Finally, she nodded. Good girl, now get ready. Wyatt moved to the door and pressed his ear against it, listening. He could hear footsteps, the creak of floorboards on the porch. Someone was right outside, probably pouring kerosene against the wood. In a few seconds, they'd light it. He took a deep breath, then kicked the door open. The man on the porch stumbled backward, surprised. Wyatt didn't give him time to recover. He fired once, the shot taking the man in the chest, and then he was moving, charging out into the night with a roar that was half rage, half desperation. Go! He shouted at Ayla. She ran. Wyatt fired again, and again, not aiming so much as creating chaos. He saw shapes moving in the darkness, heard shouts of alarm. Someone shot at him and missed, the bullet kicking up snow by his feet. He dove behind the water trough and reloaded, his hands shaking. Get her! Harlow's voice, furious now. She's running! Footsteps pounded past Wyatt's position, heading for the barn. He popped up and fired, hitting one of the runners in the leg. The man went down screaming. Another turned to shoot at Wyatt, and Wyatt dropped him with a shot to the shoulder. But there were too many. Even as he fought, he knew it. There were 6 of them and 1 of him, and he couldn't be everywhere at once. He heard a hoarse whinny, heard the barn door slam open, and then the sound he'd been praying for, hoofbeats, fast and getting faster. Ayla had made it. Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by fresh fear. She was out there alone, in the dark, with armed men chasing her, but at least she had a chance. That was more than she'd had 5 minutes ago. Someone tackled Wyatt from the side, driving him into the snow. He lost his grip on the rifle, felt a fist crack into his jaw. He swung back wildly, his knuckles connecting with something soft. The man on top of him grunted and rolled away. Wyatt scrambled to his feet, reaching for the pistol at his belt. But before he could draw it, cold steel pressed against the back of his head. Don't move, Cade's voice, breathless and angry. Wyatt froze. Harlow walked over, his face twisted with rage. Blood ran from a cut above his eye, and his coat was scorched where a bullet had grazed him. You stupid son of a bitch, he snarled. You just cost me 2 good men. Good, Wyatt said. Harlow hit him, a vicious backhand that split Wyatt's lip and sent him sprawling. Wyatt tasted blood, felt his vision swim. Strong hands grabbed him and hauled him upright. Where'd she go? Harlow demanded. Wyatt spat blood into the snow. West. You'll never catch her. We'll see about that. Cade, take Davis and ride after her. The rest of you, secure the ranch. Cade holstered his gun and ran for his horse. Wyatt tried to lunge after him, but someone hit him from behind, driving him to his knees. Pain exploded through his skull. Leave him, Harlow said. He's not going anywhere. They dragged Wyatt into the barn and tied him to one of the support posts. His hands were bound behind his back, the rope cutting into his wrists. His head throbbed where they'd hit him, and his ribs ached from the beating. But none of that mattered. All he could think about was Ayla, alone in the dark, with 2 killers on her trail. Harlow crouched in front of him, his face inches away. You should have listened to me, Mercer. Should have walked away when you had the chance. Now you're going to sit here and think about all the ways we're going to make that girl pay for the trouble she caused. Wyatt met his eyes, his voice steady, despite the pain. You touch her, and I'll kill you. I don't care how long it takes. I'll hunt you down, and I'll end you. Harlow laughed. Big talk for a man tied to a post. But sure, you keep telling yourself that. He stood and walked away, leaving Wyatt alone in the cold darkness. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Wyatt couldn't tell. The pain was making it hard to think straight, and the cold was seeping into his bones. He pulled against the ropes, trying to find some give, but they held fast. All he could do was sit there and wait, and pray that Ayla was faster than the men chasing her. Then, cutting through the silence, a single gunshot. Wyatt's heart stopped. Another shot, then a third, and then nothing. Wyatt strained against the ropes until his wrists bled, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The silence stretched out, endless and terrible. Finally, he heard hoofbeats, 2 riders coming back. Wyatt's stomach twisted into knots. Please, he thought. Please let her be alive. The barn door opened. Cade walked in, his face grim. Behind him came Davis, looking pale and shaken. Harlow stepped into view. Well? Cade shook his head. Lost her. She cut through the ravine, and by the time we found the trail again, she was gone. Disappeared like a ghost. Relief crashed over Wyatt so hard it left him dizzy. She'd made it. She was alive. Harlow cursed, kicking at a bale of hay. Damn it! Damn it! He turned to glare at Wyatt. This is your fault, all of it. Yeah, Wyatt said, his voice hoarse but triumphant. It is. Harlow pulled his pistol and aimed it at Wyatt's head. Give me one good reason I shouldn't blow your brains out right now. Wyatt smiled, blood staining his teeth. Because you're a coward, always have been. You only hurt people weaker than you, and right now, tied up and beaten, I'm still more of a man than you'll ever be. For a moment, Wyatt thought Harlow might actually pull the trigger. The rage in his eyes was murderous, his finger tight on the trigger. But then, slowly, he lowered the gun. No, Harlow said. You don't get off that easy. You're going to sit here and freeze while we figure out where that bitch ran to. And when we find her, I'm going to make you watch what we do to her. He turned and walked out. The other men followed, leaving Wyatt alone. But Wyatt wasn't afraid anymore. Ayla was free. That was all that mattered. She was out there somewhere, riding hard through the night, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, she had a real chance at escape. He closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the post. He'd done what he set out to do. He'd protected her, and if that cost him his life, so be it. It would be worth it. The cold was what kept him conscious. It bit through his coat, through his shirt, all the way down to the bone. Wyatt's wrists were raw where the rope had cut into them, his blood freezing in sticky patches on his skin. Every breath felt like swallowing glass, but he stayed awake, stayed alert, because the moment he gave in to the numbness creeping through his limbs was the moment he'd never wake up. Outside the barn, he could hear Harlow's men talking in low voices. Someone laughed, the sound grating and ugly. A bottle passed between them, whiskey probably, stolen from his cabin. Wyatt tested the ropes again, twisting his wrists, searching for any weakness in the knots. Nothing. Whoever had tied him knew what they were doing. Time crawled. Minutes felt like hours. The barn door was cracked open just enough for moonlight to spill across the floor in a thin silver line. Wyatt watched it creep across the boards, marking the passage of time he didn't have. Then he heard something else. Footsteps. Light. Deliberate. Coming closer. The barn door creaked wider, and a figure slipped inside. Small. Moving like a shadow. Wyatt's heart slammed against his ribs. Ayla. She pressed a finger to her lips, her eyes gleaming in the darkness. She moved toward him in a crouch, keeping low, a knife clutched in her hand. When she reached him, she dropped to her knees and started sawing at the ropes. What the hell are you doing here? Wyatt hissed. Saving you, she whispered back, her breath coming fast. Be quiet. You were supposed to run. I did. Then I came back. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Shut up and let me work. The knife was dull and the rope was thick. It took precious seconds, each one stretching taut as a wire. Wyatt kept his eyes on the door, listening for any change in the voices outside. If Harlow's men came back now, they were both dead. The last strand of rope gave way. Wyatt pulled his hands free, biting back a groan as blood rushed back into his fingers. Ayla helped him to his feet, and he nearly collapsed. His legs had gone numb from the cold and the lack of circulation. Can you walk? She asked. Yeah, just give me a second. She handed him a pistol, the revolver he'd given her days ago. There's 3 of them left. Harlow, the thin one called Davis, and one other I don't recognize. Where? Front of the cabin, drinking. They think you're secure in here. Wyatt nodded, his mind already working through options. 3 against 2. Bad odds, but better than 6. And they had the element of surprise. All right, he said quietly. Here's what we do. You go to the corral, get the horses ready. Soon as you hear shooting, you ride. Don't wait for me, just go. Ayla's eyes flashed. No. Ayla, I'm not leaving you again. We do this together or not at all. There was no time to argue. Wyatt could see it in the set of her jaw, the way her hand gripped the knife. She'd made up her mind, and nothing he said would change it. Fine, he said. But you stay behind me, and if things go bad, you run. Understood? Understood. They moved to the barn door and peered out. The 3 men were exactly where Ayla said they'd be, sitting on the porch steps of the cabin, passing a bottle between them. They looked relaxed, confident. That would be their mistake. Wyatt checked the revolver. 5 rounds. Not enough for a prolonged fight, but enough for what needed doing. He glanced at Ayla, saw her nod, and they slipped out into the night. The snow muffled their footsteps as they crept across the yard. Wyatt kept to the shadows, using the corral fence as cover. 20 feet from the cabin. 15. 10. Close enough now that he could hear their conversation. Should have just shot him when we had the chance, Davis was saying. Now we gotta babysit the son of a bitch all night. Harlow wants him alive, the other man said. Wants to use him as bait when the girl comes back. She ain't coming back. She's probably halfway to the next territory by now. Maybe, but Harlow don't think so. Says she's got a soft spot for the old rancher. Says she'll come back for him. Harlow took a long pull from the bottle and wiped his mouth. She will. Women are stupid that way. Can't help themselves. They get attached, and they make mistakes. Wyatt stepped out of the shadows, the revolver leveled at Harlow's head. You're right about one thing, he said. Somebody made a mistake tonight, but it wasn't her. All 3 men froze. Harlow's hand started moving toward his gun, then stopped when Wyatt cocked the hammer. Don't, Wyatt said. Davis started to stand. Ayla stepped out behind Wyatt, her rifle aimed at Davis's chest. Sit down. He sat. For a moment, nobody moved. The wind whistled through the gap between the cabin and the barn, and somewhere in the distance a coyote howled. Wyatt kept the gun steady, his finger resting light on the trigger. Well, Harlow said finally, looks like I underestimated you both. Yeah, Wyatt said. You did. What now? You gonna shoot us in cold blood? That make you better than me? Never said I was better, but I'll sleep fine tonight either way. Harlow's eyes narrowed. You won't get away with this. Kill us, and there'll be people asking questions, people looking for us. Let them look. Won't change what happens here. Wyatt. Ayla's voice soft but urgent. He glanced back at her. She was looking past the men, toward the horizon. Wyatt followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. Riders. At least 4 of them, coming hard from the south. Expecting company? Wyatt asked. Harlow smiled, and it was the ugliest thing Wyatt had ever seen. Insurance. You didn't think I'd come out here with just 5 men, did you? I got friends, and they're about 2 minutes away. Wyatt cursed under his breath. 4 more men meant 7 total. Even with surprise on their side, those were suicide odds. What do we do? Ayla asked. Wyatt's mind raced. They couldn't fight. Couldn't run. Not with the horses still in the corral. They had seconds to make a decision that would determine whether they lived or died. Inside, he said. Now. They backed toward the cabin door, keeping their guns trained on the 3 men. Harlow started to stand, but Wyatt shook his head. Stay put. You move before those riders get here. I'll put a bullet in you. They'll kill you anyway, Harlow said. Least this way you'll have company in hell. Wyatt and Ayla slipped through the door and slammed it shut. Wyatt threw the bolt and started piling furniture against it, the same barricade they'd built earlier. Ayla ran to the window and looked out. They're almost here, she said. How many can you count? 4. No, 5. One's lagging behind. Wyatt joined her at the window. The riders were spreading out as they approached, circling the cabin like wolves around wounded prey. Professional. These weren't hired thugs, they were experienced men, the kind who killed for a living. We're trapped, Ayla said, her voice barely above a whisper. Not yet, Wyatt said, though he didn't believe it himself. The riders pulled up in front of the cabin. Harlow stood and walked over to the lead rider, a tall man with a black duster and a hat pulled low over his eyes. They spoke in voices too low to hear, Harlow gesturing toward the cabin. The tall man nodded, then turned his horse to face the door. "Mercer," he called out. "Name's Garrett. I'm here on behalf of Mr. Harlow. You got 10 seconds to open that door and come out peaceful-like, or we're coming in. And if we have to come in, it's going to get real ugly real fast." Wyatt didn't answer. 5 seconds, Garrett shouted. Ayla looked at Wyatt, her eyes wide with fear. "What do we do?" Wyatt looked around the cabin, at the boarded windows, the barricaded door, the meager supplies they had left. They could hold out for maybe an hour, maybe less. And then what? They'd run out of ammunition, run out of options, and the men outside would burn them out or storm the cabin. But giving up wasn't an option either, not after everything they'd been through. "We fight," Wyatt said. The door exploded inward under a barrage of gunfire. Wood splintered, glass shattered. Wyatt and Ayla dove for cover as bullets tore through the cabin, punching holes in the walls, the furniture, everything. Wyatt fired back through the gap in the window, aiming for the muzzle flashes. Beside him, Ayla did the same, her shots sharp and precise. The gunfight was chaos again, worse than before. There were too many of them, shooting from too many angles. Wyatt emptied the revolver, reloaded, emptied it again. His ears were ringing, his eyes stinging from gun smoke. A bullet grazed his shoulder, a hot line of pain that made him gasp. But he kept firing. Then the shooting stopped. Wyatt and Ayla crouched behind the overturned table, breathing hard. The cabin was a wreck. Holes in the walls, furniture destroyed, the smell of gunpowder so thick it was hard to breathe. "Mercer!" Garrett's voice again. "That was just a taste. You want to keep going? We can do this all night. Or you can be smart, throw down your guns, and come out." Wyatt looked at Ayla. Her face was streaked with soot and sweat, her hands shaking as she reloaded the rifle. But her eyes were clear, determined. "I'm not giving up," she said. "Me neither." "Then I guess we die together." Wyatt reached out and took her hand, squeezing it once. "There's worse ways to go." She smiled, sad and small. "Yeah, there are." "All right," Wyatt shouted through the broken window. "You want us? Come and get us." More gunfire erupted, and Wyatt fired back. But even as he did, he knew this was the end. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of ammunition. Any moment now, one of those bullets would find its mark, and that would be it. Then something changed. A new sound cut through the gunfire. Hoofbeats, fast and getting closer, and voices, shouting orders. The shooting from outside faltered, then stopped. Wyatt risked a glance through the window and saw riders pouring into the yard. 6 of them. No, 8. All armed, all moving with military precision, and in the lead was a man Wyatt recognized, Marshal Hendricks. "Drop your weapons," Hendricks roared. "You're all under arrest." Chaos erupted outside. Some of Harlow's men tried to run. Others tried to fight. But Hendricks and his deputies were ready. Gunshots rang out, brief and decisive. Within minutes, it was over. Wyatt lowered his gun, disbelief washing over him. "How—" "The girl," Ayla said, her voice stunned. "When I rode west, I passed a camp. Hunters, I thought. But one of them. He asked if I was in trouble. I told him what was happening. He must have ridden for help." Wyatt let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. "You beautiful, stubborn woman." The cabin door burst open, and Hendricks stepped inside, his gun drawn. He looked around at the destruction, then at Wyatt and Ayla. "Mercer," he said, "you look like hell." "Feel like it too," Wyatt said, leaning heavily against the wall. "Glad you showed up when you did." "Got word there was trouble out here. Came as fast as we could." He holstered his gun. "You two all right?" "We'll live." Hendricks nodded, then stepped back outside. Through the broken window, Wyatt could see Harlow and his men being herded into a line, their hands bound. Harlow's face was a mask of rage, but there was fear there too, the kind that came from knowing the game was over, and you'd lost. Ayla slumped against the wall, the rifle slipping from her hands. "Is it really over?" "Yeah," Wyatt said, moving to sit beside her. "It's over." She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. "I thought we were going to die." "So did I." They sat there together in the wreckage of the cabin, too exhausted to move, as the deputies outside finished securing the prisoners. After a few minutes, Hendricks came back in. "We're taking them to Clarksville," he said. "There's a judge there who'll see them hang for what they've done. You two need to come too. Give statements." Wyatt nodded. "We will. Just give us a minute." Hendricks studied them both, his expression softening. "Take your time. I'll send one of my men to help patch up the cabin in the morning." "Appreciate it." When Hendricks left, Wyatt turned to Ayla. She was staring at her hands, still shaking. He reached out and took them in his own. "Hey," he said gently. "Look at me." She did, her eyes red and swollen. "You did good," Wyatt said. "Real good. If you hadn't gone for help, we'd both be dead right now." "I almost didn't," she admitted. "I almost kept writing, but I couldn't leave you. I couldn't just run and save myself when you were here fighting for me." "You came back," Wyatt said. "That's what matters." "I came back because you mattered," she said, echoing his words from weeks ago. "Because you stood up for me when no one else would. Because you're the first person in my whole life who treated me like I was worth something." Wyatt's throat tightened. "You're worth something. Don't ever let anyone tell you different." She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arms around her. They stayed like that for a long time, holding on to each other in the ruins of the cabin. Two people who'd survived the worst and somehow found something precious in the process. Eventually, they had to move. The deputies needed statements, and there were logistics to handle. But as they walked out of the cabin together into the cold morning air, Wyatt felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. The next few days were a blur of activity. Hendricks and his men took Harlow and the others to Clarksville, and Wyatt and Ayla went along to testify. The judge was a hard man with no patience for scum like Harlow, and the trial was short. Guilty on all counts. Sentencing came down swift and final. Hanging. Wyatt and Ayla didn't stay to watch. They'd seen enough violence to last a lifetime. On the ride back to the ranch, they were quiet. The landscape rolled past, white and empty, and Wyatt found himself thinking about the future. For the first time in a long while, he had one worth thinking about. "What are you going to do now?" Ayla asked as they approached the ranch. Wyatt glanced at her. "Fix the cabin. Mend the fences. Get ready for spring." "And after that?" "Don't know. Haven't thought that far ahead." He paused. "What about you?" Ayla was silent for a moment. "I don't know either. I've been running for so long, I'm not sure I know how to stop." "Well," Wyatt said carefully, "you're welcome to stay, if you want. No pressure." She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "You mean that?" "Wouldn't say it if I didn't." "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not. You pull your weight. Hell, you pull more than your weight. And besides," he trailed off, unsure how to finish. "Besides what?" "Besides, I like having you around," Wyatt said, the words coming out rougher than he'd intended. "Place feels less empty with you here." Ayla smiled, small and tentative. "It feels less lonely for me, too." They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, and when they reached the ranch, they dismounted together and stood looking at the cabin. It was damaged, sure. The windows would need replacing, the door needed fixing, half the furniture was destroyed, but it was still standing, still home. "We've got work to do," Wyatt said. "Yeah," Ayla agreed, "we do." Over the next few weeks, they threw themselves into repairs. Wyatt fixed the door and replaced the broken windows while Ayla patched the holes in the walls and swept out the debris. They worked side by side, falling back into the rhythm they'd built before Harlow and his men had shattered it. But something had changed between them. The easy silence was still there, but now it was underscored by something deeper. A connection forged in fire and fear, tempered by trust and survival. They moved around each other with an awareness that hadn't been there before, their hands brushing as they passed tools, their eyes meeting across the room and holding for just a moment too long. One night, after a long day of work, they sat by the fire. The cabin was warm again, the worst of the damage repaired. Outside, the wind howled, but inside it was safe and quiet. "Can I ask you something?" Ayla said. "Sure." "What made you stop at the train station that night? Really?" Wyatt thought about that. He'd given her an answer before, but it hadn't been the whole truth. The whole truth was harder to put into words. "I saw someone who needed help," he said slowly, "and I couldn't walk away. Maybe it was because of Sarah." Maybe it was because I was tired of being alone. Or maybe it was just that you looked at me like I was someone worth trusting, even though you had no reason to. Whatever it was, I'm glad I stopped." "Me too," Ayla said softly. She shifted closer, and Wyatt felt his heart kick up a notch. He'd been alone for so long, he'd forgotten what it felt like to want someone nearby. But he wanted her presence, her strength, her quiet resilience. "Wyatt," she said. "Yeah? Thank you for everything. Don't need to thank me." "I know, but I'm going to anyway." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and Wyatt put his arm around her. They sat like that, watching the fire burn down to embers, and for the first time in years, Wyatt felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The winter began to ease. The days grew incrementally longer, the snow started to melt in patches, and the air lost some of its killing edge. Wyatt and Ayla settled into a new routine, one that felt less like survival and more like living. Ayla began teaching him things she'd learned from her people: how to read the signs in the sky to predict weather, how to find water in dry ground, how to move through the land without disturbing it. Wyatt listened and learned, impressed by the depth of her knowledge. In turn, he taught her more about ranching: how to rope and brand, how to doctor a sick calf, how to judge horseflesh and negotiate a fair price. She soaked it all up, her quick mind grasping concepts that had taken him years to learn. They talked more too, about their pasts, their regrets, their hopes. Ayla told him about her mother, a woman who'd been fierce and loving and determined to give her daughter a better life than she'd had. Wyatt told her about his childhood on a hardscrabble farm in Missouri, about the brother who'd died young and the father who'd drunk himself to death. "We're both running from ghosts," Ayla said one night. "Maybe," Wyatt agreed, "but maybe we're running toward something too." "Like what?" "A future. A real one." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "You really think that's possible? After everything?" "I do," Wyatt said. "Don't you?" Ayla was quiet for a long moment, then she nodded. "Yeah, I think I do." As winter gave way to early spring, the land began to wake up. The first green shoots pushed through the mud. The creek, frozen solid for months, began to thaw and flow again. Birds returned, filling the air with song, and the ranch, battered but unbroken, started to feel like a place where new things could grow. One morning, Wyatt was out checking the fence line when he saw Ayla standing at the top of the ridge, looking out across the valley. The wind caught her hair, pulling it loose from its braid, and the sunlight made her skin glow. She looked strong, free, beautiful. He climbed up to join her. "Thinking about something?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "Nothing. I don't know." She turned to look at him. "I never thought I'd feel safe anywhere, but I feel safe here. With you." Wyatt's chest tightened. "I'm glad." "Are you?" "Glad I stayed." "Yeah," he said. "I am." She smiled, and it reached all the way to her eyes. "Good, because I'm not planning on going anywhere." Relief and something warmer flooded through him. "That's so. That's so." They stood there together on the ridge, the wind whipping around them, the valley spread out below like a promise. And Wyatt realized that this, right here, was what he'd been searching for all along. Not just a place to call home, but someone to share it with, someone who understood what it meant to survive, someone who'd chosen to stay, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. "Come on," he said, taking her hand. "Let's go home." And together, they walked down the ridge toward the ranch, toward a future neither of them had dared to imagine just a few months before. Spring came slow that year, like it was testing the ground before committing. The snow retreated in patches, leaving mud and dead grass behind. The creek swelled with runoff, and the fields turned from white to brown to, eventually, a hesitant green. Wyatt and Ayla worked through it all, their hands raw from mending fences, their backs aching from hauling water and clearing debris left by the winter storms. But there was a lightness to the work now that hadn't been there before, a sense of building toward something instead of just holding on. They fell into an easy partnership, each knowing what the other needed without having to ask. Wyatt would start a job and Ayla would appear with the right tool. She'd struggle with a heavy post and he'd step in to brace it. They moved around each other like dancers who'd practiced the same routine 1,000 times. One afternoon in early April, they were working on the north pasture fence when Ayla paused, leaning on her post digger. You ever think about expanding the herd? Wyatt looked up from the wire he was stringing. Thought about it. Why? This land could support more cattle. Maybe sheep, too. And if we planted hay in the south field, we'd have feed through winter without having to buy it. We, Wyatt repeated, a smile tugging at his mouth. Ayla flushed slightly. I mean, if I'm staying, I should pull my weight. Help make this place profitable. You already pull your weight, but yeah, those are good ideas. He went back to the wire, trying to hide how much that single word had meant to him. We. Like they were partners. Like this was as much hers as his. They finished the fence line as the sun started to dip, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Walking back to the ranch, Wyatt found himself watching her out of the corner of his eye. The way she moved, confident and sure-footed. The way her hair caught the last of the light. The way she smiled at something he'd said, a real smile that reached her eyes. He was falling for her. Had been for a while, if he was honest. But admitting it to himself was one thing, doing something about it was another. That night, after supper, they sat on the porch. The air was finally warm enough to be outside without freezing, and the stars were coming out one by one. Ayla had her feet pulled up under her, wrapped in a blanket, and Wyatt sat on the step below, his back against the post. Can I tell you something? Ayla said. Always. When I was running, before I got to the train station, I kept thinking that if I could just get far enough away, I'd find someplace where I belonged, someplace where people would see me as more than just another drifter or a pair of hands to exploit. She paused, her voice softening. I found it here. With you. Wyatt turned to look at her. You belong here. You know that, right? I'm starting to, she said. But it's hard. I spent so long not belonging anywhere that it's hard to believe this is real, that it's going to last. It'll last as long as you want it to. What about you? What do you want? The question hung in the air between them. Wyatt could deflect, change the subject, keep things safe and undefined. But he was tired of being alone, tired of keeping his walls up. I want you to stay, he said. Not just because you're a good worker or because the place runs better with two people. I want you to stay because I care about you, because I've gotten used to having you around and I don't want to go back to how it was before. Ayla's eyes glistened in the starlight. I care about you too, more than I thought I could care about anyone. Yeah? Yeah. Wyatt stood and crossed to where she sat, settling beside her on the bench. He took her hand and she laced her fingers through his. They sat like that for a while, not speaking, just being together. And it was enough. The days grew longer and warmer. The work continued, relentless as always, but now there were moments of lightness woven through it. Ayla taught Wyatt songs from her childhood, humming them while they worked. He taught her to play cards, and they'd sit up late into the night playing hand after hand, betting chores instead of money. When she won, which was often, she'd laugh with genuine delight, and the sound of it made something in Wyatt's chest unfurl. They talked about the future more openly now. Where to plant the garden, which breed of cattle would do best on this land, whether they should build a second barn or expand the existing one. Every conversation reinforced the same truth. They were building something together, something permanent, but there were still shadows. Ayla had nightmares sometimes, waking in a cold sweat, her breathing ragged. The first time it happened, Wyatt heard her from his cot and came to check on her. She was sitting by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, staring into the flames. You all right? He asked. She nodded without looking at him. Just bad dreams. He sat down beside her. Want to talk about it? Not really. She was quiet for a moment, then said, I keep seeing Harlow's face. Keep hearing his voice. Sometimes I wake up, and I'm back in that house, and I can't get out. He's gone, Wyatt said gently. He can't hurt you anymore. I know, but my brain doesn't seem to care what I know. It just keeps replaying the worst parts over and over. Wyatt understood that. He'd had his own nightmares over the years. Sarah's death, the men he'd killed in the war, moments when he'd failed or come close to dying. The past had a way of clawing its way back, especially in the dark. It gets easier, he said. Not gone, but easier. You learn to live with it. How? By focusing on what's in front of you, by building something good enough that the bad stuff can't drown it out. He looked at her. You're safe here, Ayla. I promise you that. And as long as I'm breathing, no one's going to hurt you again." She leaned against him and he put his arm around her. They stayed like that until the fire burned low and her breathing evened out into sleep. Wyatt carried her to her bedroll, covered her with a blanket, and went back to his own cot. But sleep didn't come easy for him either that night. In late April, Wyatt made a trip into town for supplies. Ayla wanted to come, but he convinced her to stay and finish planting the garden. The truth was, he had something to do that he wanted to do alone. The town of Clarksville was small and dusty, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. Wyatt tied Tucker outside the general store and went inside. He bought flour, salt, coffee, and a few other staples, loading them into the saddlebags. Then he walked down the street to a small shop he'd noticed on his last visit. The jeweler was an old man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He looked up when Wyatt entered, his expression shifting from indifferent to curious. "Help you with something?" "Yeah," Wyatt said, feeling suddenly awkward. "I'm looking for a ring." The old man's eyebrows rose. "Wedding ring?" "Not exactly, just something nice, simple, nothing fancy." The jeweler studied him for a moment, then nodded and pulled a tray from beneath the counter. It held a dozen rings, most of them plain bands in silver or gold. Wyatt looked them over, trying to imagine which one Ayla might like. "This one," the jeweler said, picking up a silver band with a small turquoise stone set in the middle. "Turquoise is good luck, symbol of protection." Wyatt held it up to the light. It was simple but beautiful, the kind of thing that wouldn't get in the way of hard work but would still catch the eye. "How much?" $20. Wyatt winced. That was a good chunk of his savings. But he pulled out the coins and counted them onto the counter. The jeweler wrapped the ring in a small cloth and handed it over. "She's a lucky woman," he said. "I'm the lucky one," Wyatt replied. He rode back to the ranch with the ring tucked safely in his coat pocket, his mind turning over how to give it to her. He'd never been good with words, and this felt too important to mess up. But by the time he reached the ranch, he still hadn't figured it out. Ayla was in the garden when he arrived, dirt on her hands and a smudge of mud on her cheek. She looked up and smiled when she saw him. "How was town?" "Fine. Got everything we needed." He dismounted and started unloading the supplies, trying to act normal even though his heart was hammering. They worked together to put everything away, and then Ayla went to wash up while Wyatt fed the horses. By the time she came back, the sun was setting, and the sky was that particular shade of purple that only happened in spring. "Walk with me?" Wyatt asked. "Wyatt what?" She looked surprised but nodded. They headed out past the corral toward the ridge where they'd stood weeks ago looking out at the valley. The evening air was cool but not cold, and the first stars were beginning to appear. When they reached the top, Wyatt stopped and turned to face her. "I got you something in town," he said. "Wyatt, you didn't have to." "I know, but I wanted to." He pulled the small cloth bundle from his pocket and handed it to her. Ayla unwrapped it slowly, her eyes widening when she saw the ring. "Wyatt?" "It's not a proposal," he said quickly. "Not in the traditional sense, anyway. I know we haven't known each other that long, and I know you've got your own path to walk. But I want you to have it, as a promise." "A promise of what?" "That you've got a place here, that you're not alone, that whatever comes next, we face it together, if you want to." Ayla's eyes filled with tears. She slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. "I want to," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I want that more than anything." Wyatt pulled her into his arms, and she held on to him tight. They stood there on the ridge as the stars came out, two people who'd been broken and lost finding something whole in each other. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest of Wyatt's life. The ranch thrived under their combined efforts. The garden came in strong, and they sold vegetables in town for a decent profit. The cattle were healthy, and Wyatt managed to buy 3 more head to expand the herd. Ayla proved to have a knack for training horses, and word spread. People started bringing their unbroken mounts to the ranch, paying good money for her to gentle them. They fell into a rhythm that felt natural, inevitable. Mornings were for hard work, afternoons for repairs and planning, evenings for sitting together and talking or just being quiet. They laughed more, touched more. The boundaries between them, already thin, dissolved completely. One night in June, after a long day of branding calves, they sat by the fire. Ayla was leaning against Wyatt's shoulder, his arm around her, and he realized with a start that he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt this content. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "How different things are now. How much better." "Better than what?" "Than before you showed up." She tilted her head to look up at him. "You saved my life, you know, that night at the train station. If you'd walked past, I don't think I would have made it. You would have found a way. You're stronger than you think." "Maybe, but I'm glad I didn't have to find out." She shifted, turning to face him more fully. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Do you ever regret it? Stopping for me? Taking me in? All the trouble that came after?" Wyatt didn't hesitate. "Not for a second. Even when Harlow and his men came? Even when we almost died? Even then. Because if I hadn't stopped, I'd still be alone. And this ranch would still be just a place I lived, not a home." He cupped her face in his hand, his thumb brushing her cheek. "You made it a home, Ayla." She kissed him then, slow and sweet, and Wyatt felt something click into place inside him. This was what he'd been missing all those years. Not just companionship, but partnership. Not just someone to share the work with, but someone to share his life with. When they finally pulled apart, Ayla rested her forehead against his. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," Wyatt said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Summer arrived in full force, hot and bright. The work was harder in the heat, but they managed. Wyatt built a small addition onto the cabin, a separate room with a real bed and a window facing east to catch the morning light. It was meant to be Ayla's room, but more often than not they ended up sleeping side by side, the boundaries between their spaces as blurred as everything else. They started talking about making it official. A wedding. Nothing fancy, just a simple ceremony in town with the preacher and maybe a few witnesses. But every time they got close to setting a date, something would come up. A fence that needed mending, a sick calf, a storm rolling in. "We're putting it off," Ayla said one evening. Wyatt looked up from the harness he was repairing. "What?" "The wedding. We keep saying we'll do it, but then we find reasons not to. Why?" He set down the harness. "I don't know. I guess part of me feels like we don't need a piece of paper to prove what we already know." "Which is what?" "That we're committed. That we're in this together." Ayla smiled. "I feel the same way. But I also think there's something to be said for making it official. For standing up in front of people and saying, this is who I choose, this is who I want to spend my life with." "You're right," Wyatt said. "So let's do it. Next week. No more excuses." "Next week," Ayla agreed. But before they could make it to town, trouble found them one more time. It was a hot afternoon in July when a rider appeared on the horizon. Wyatt was in the barn, and Ayla was in the garden. She saw the rider first and called out to Wyatt, her voice tight with alarm. He came out, rifle in hand, but relaxed when he saw it was just one person. A woman, riding slow and looking exhausted. As she got closer, Wyatt recognized her. It was Martha Hendricks, the marshal's wife. She dismounted stiffly, her face pale and drawn. "Mr. Mercer, Miss Ayla." "Mrs. Hendricks," Wyatt said. "What brings you out here?" "Bad news, I'm afraid." She took a breath. "One of Harlow's men escaped from jail last week. A man named Silas. We thought we had him cornered in the hills, but he gave us the slip. My husband thinks he might be headed this way." Wyatt felt his stomach drop. "Why here?" "Revenge, maybe. Or maybe he thinks Ayla knows something about where Harlow hid his money. Either way, the marshal wanted me to warn you. He's riding this way with deputies, but it'll be a few hours before they get here." Ayla had gone pale, her hand gripping the garden fence. Wyatt moved to her side, putting a hand on her shoulder. "We'll be ready," he said to Martha. "Thank you for the warning." Martha nodded, climbed back onto her horse, and rode off. Wyatt and Ayla stood in the yard, the heat pressing down on them like a weight. "Not again," Ayla said quietly. "I can't do this again." "You won't have to," Wyatt said. "We'll handle it, together." They spent the next hour preparing. Wyatt loaded the rifles and positioned them around the cabin. Ayla checked the horses, making sure they were ready in case they needed to run. But this time felt different. They weren't panicked or scared. They were calm, determined. They'd faced worse and survived. Silas showed up just before dusk, riding in alone. He was a wiry man with a mean face and eyes that held nothing but hate. He stopped about 50 yards from the cabin and dismounted. "Isla Redfern!" he shouted. "I know you're in there!" Wyatt stepped onto the porch, rifle held ready. "She is. And she's staying, so turn around and ride out while you still can." Silas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You cost me everything, old man. Cost me my friends, my job, my freedom. I'm here to collect what's owed." "You're owed nothing," Wyatt said. "You made your choices. Now you get to live with them." "Not without taking her with me, I don't." Silas reached for his gun, and Wyatt fired. The shot hit Silas in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to his knees. His gun fell from his hand, and he clutched at the wound, blood seeping between his fingers. Wyatt walked forward, keeping the rifle trained on him. "Stay down!" Silas looked up at him, his face twisted with pain and rage. "You think you've won? You think this is over?" "Yeah," Wyatt said. "I do." He heard hoofbeats and turned to see Marshal Hendricks and 3 deputies riding hard toward the ranch. They pulled up, dismounted, and Hendricks took in the scene with a grim nod. "Silas Gant," he said, "you're under arrest. Again." The deputies hauled Silas to his feet and bound his hands. Hendricks walked over to Wyatt and extended a hand. "Appreciate you not killing him," the marshal said. "Saves us the paperwork." "Wasn't planning to," Wyatt replied. "Just wanted him to stop." Hendricks looked past Wyatt to where Ayla stood in the doorway, her face pale but resolute. "You two all right?" "We're fine," Ayla said. "Good. We'll take him back to Clarksville, and this time we'll make damn sure he doesn't escape." Hendricks tipped his hat. "You folks take care." They watched the marshal and his men ride off with Silas slumped in the saddle, still bleeding and cursing. When they were out of sight, Wyatt lowered the rifle and let out a long breath. "It's really over now," he said. Ayla came down the steps and stood beside him, her hand finding his. "Yeah, it is." They went inside and sat by the fire, even though it was too warm for it. They needed the light, the sense of normalcy. After a while, Ayla spoke. "I used to think I'd never be free of them, that no matter how far I ran, they'd always find me. But today, when Silas showed up, I wasn't afraid, not like before, because I knew I wasn't alone." "You're not," Wyatt said, "and you never will be again." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Let's go to town tomorrow. Get married like we planned. I don't want to wait anymore." "Neither do I." The next morning they rode into Clarksville together. The town was busy, people going about their business, and no one paid them much attention. They went to the preacher's house, a small cottage on the edge of town, and knocked on the door. Reverend Talbot was a kind man with gray hair and a gentle manner. When Wyatt explained what they wanted, he smiled. "I'd be honored," he said. "Do you have witnesses?" Wyatt looked at Ayla, and she shrugged. They hadn't thought that far ahead. "We can find some," the Reverend said. "Give me a moment." He disappeared into the house and came back with his wife and a neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Calhoun. They all gathered in the small parlor, and the Reverend opened his Bible. The ceremony was short and simple. Wyatt and Ayla stood facing each other, their hands joined, as the Reverend spoke about commitment and partnership. When it came time for the vows, Wyatt's voice was steady. "I promise to stand by you, to protect you, to work with you and build a life together, for as long as I live." Ayla's voice wavered slightly, but her eyes were clear. "I promise to trust you, to fight beside you, to make this ranch our home and to never give up on what we're building, for as long as I live." The Reverend pronounced them married and Wyatt kissed her, brief and chaste, but full of promise. Mrs. Calhoun clapped, and the Reverend's wife produced a cake she'd baked that morning. They all shared it, talking and laughing, and for an hour Wyatt and Ayla were just two people celebrating a new beginning. When they rode back to the ranch that afternoon, Ayla kept looking at the simple gold band Wyatt had bought to match her turquoise ring. She turned it on her finger, smiling to herself. "What?" Wyatt asked. "I'm married," she said, like she couldn't quite believe it. "I never thought I'd say that. Never thought I'd find someone who'd want to marry me." "Why not?" "Because I've spent so much of my life just trying to survive. Marriage seemed like something other people did. People who had homes and stability and futures. You have all that now." "I know. It's just taking some getting used to." When they reached the ranch, Wyatt dismounted and helped Ayla down. They stood in the yard looking at the cabin, the barn, the fields stretching out to the horizon. It wasn't much, just a small ranch in the middle of nowhere, but it was theirs. "Come on," Wyatt said, taking her hand. "Let's go home." The years that followed were good ones. Not perfect, because nothing ever is, but good. The ranch prospered. They expanded the herd, built a second barn, and planted an orchard that would take years to mature but would be worth the wait. Ayla's horse training brought in steady income, and Wyatt's reputation as a fair dealer spread. People came from miles around to do business with them. They had arguments, of course, about money, about work, about the 100 small things that couples argue about. But they always worked through them, because underneath it all was a foundation of respect and trust that nothing could shake. Ayla's nightmares became less frequent, though they never went away completely. But she learned to manage them, and Wyatt learned when to push and when to give her space. He had his own demons, and she returned the favor, sitting with him on the nights when the past came calling and offering nothing more than her presence. They talked about children sometimes, but it never happened. Whether it was age or biology or just fate, Wyatt didn't know. Part of him was disappointed, but a larger part was at peace with it. He and Ayla were enough. They didn't need anything more to make their life complete. One evening, years later, they sat on the porch watching the sun set. Wyatt's hair had gone completely gray, and Ayla had lines around her eyes from years of squinting into the sun. But they were still strong, still capable, still together. "You ever regret it?" Ayla asked. It was the same question she'd asked years ago, but the context was different now. "Regret what?" "All of this. The ranch, me, the life we built. It's been hard. A lot of work. Do you ever wish you'd done something different?" Wyatt thought about that, about the years of backbreaking labor, the close calls, the struggles to make ends meet, about the loneliness that had defined so much of his early life. "No," he said, "not for a second." "Why not?" "Because this is the life I was supposed to have. You're the person I was supposed to find, and everything that came before was just getting me here." Ayla reached for his hand, and he took it. They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from orange to purple to black, and the stars came out one by one. "You know what I think?" Ayla said after a while. "What's that?" "I think people are always looking for the big moments, the dramatic rescues, the grand gestures, the life-changing decisions. But the real magic is in the small stuff. The everyday choosing to stay, the work you put in when no one's watching, the trust you build one conversation at a time." Wyatt smiled. "When'd you get so wise?" "I married a good teacher." He laughed, and she laughed with him, and for a moment they were young again, two people standing on a ridge looking at a future full of possibility. "You saved me," Ayla said quietly. "That night at the train station. But I think I saved you too." "Yeah," Wyatt agreed. "You did." They sat there until the night grew cold, and then they went inside together, to the home they'd built, to the life they'd chosen, to the partnership that had transformed them both. And looking back on all of it, from that frozen night at the train station to this warm evening on the porch, Wyatt understood something fundamental about the human experience. We're all running from something: fear, pain, loneliness, the weight of our pasts, and we're all searching for something too. Safety, belonging, purpose, love. The miracle isn't finding those things. The miracle is recognizing them when they appear, often in the most unexpected places and the most unlikely people. And then having the courage to reach out and hold on, even when everything tells you to keep running. Wyatt had stopped for Ayla because he saw someone who needed help. But in helping her, he'd helped himself. In offering her shelter, he'd found a home. In giving her a chance to start over, he'd been given the same gift. That's the thing about kindness, about standing up for what's right even when it's hard, about choosing to see people as people instead of problems or opportunities. It comes back to you in ways you can't predict. It changes you, makes you better, reminds you what it means to be human. Ayla had come to his ranch with nothing but trauma and fear. She'd left that behind and built a new life, one defined not by what had been done to her, but by what she chose to do next. And in watching her transform, Wyatt had transformed too. The lonely rancher who'd given up on connection had learned to open his heart again. The man who'd thought his best days were behind him had discovered they were just beginning. That's the story. Not just of two people who found each other, but of what happens when you choose courage over comfort, when you choose to stay instead of run, when you choose to build instead of just survive. It's a story about second chances and new beginnings, about how the hardest thing someone can do is trust again after being broken, about how home isn't a place, it's a person, and about how sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is simply refuse to let them face their demons alone. Wyatt and Ayla's story didn't end with a dramatic rescue or a perfect resolution. It ended with two imperfect people building an imperfect life together, day by day, choice by choice, until the sum of all those small decisions became something beautiful. And isn't that what we're all trying to do? Build something that matters. Find someone who sees us. Create a life worth living. They did that. Against all odds, through fire and fear and everything that tried to tear them apart, they did that. And that, more than anything else, is worth celebrating. The next morning, Wyatt woke early, as he always did. The sun was just starting to break over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Beside him, Ayla was still sleeping, her breathing soft and even. He watched her for a moment, this woman who'd changed everything, and felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. He slipped out of bed quietly and went outside. The ranch was waking up around him. Birds singing, horses stirring in the corral, the wind carrying the smell of grass and earth and possibility. He stood in the yard, his yard, and looked out at the land he and Ayla had built into something real. Behind him, the cabin door opened. Ayla emerged, wrapped in a shawl, her hair loose around her shoulders. She came to stand beside him, and he put his arm around her. "Morning," she said. "Morning." They stood together, watching the sun rise, and Wyatt thought about all the mornings that had come before and all the ones that would come after. He thought about the journey that had brought them here, the pain and the struggle and the moments of grace, and he thought about how none of it had been wasted. Every hard mile, every difficult choice, every moment of doubt had led him exactly where he needed to be. "Ready for another day?" Ayla asked. Wyatt smiled and pulled her closer. "With you?" "Always." They turned and walked back toward the cabin together, toward the work that waited, toward the life they'd chosen. And as they crossed the threshold, Wyatt looked back one more time at the rising sun, at the land stretching out before them, at the future they were building together. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything.